What an honor it is to be a speaker at this meeting. There's an old expression in science when you're trying to be modest about your accomplishments. You say, we are standing on the shoulders of giants. Not today. We are rubbing shoulders with giants. The people that have spoken before me are literally giants, especially in our time when there's such a shortage of information of this type and of interpretation of this type. And I want to remind you that we have a giant sitting in the back row, although I can't see her face. Is Jane here? Okay, see, she's so modest she doesn't even respond. Jane is the giant of this organization who has put together this program, and I want to give her a special hand of applause, even though she... Anyway, this is a new overall subject for me. I've talked about things related to this in the past, and I'll try to not be too repetitive. I'm going to start with some history. This book, Silent Spring, by Rachel Carson. How many here have seen the book? Okay, how many people have read it? Wow, that's terrific. Okay, how many people agree with it? We got 3 hands. Aha, we have some education to do. Okay. This was a book where Rachel Carson attacked industrial chemicals, and the biggest villain in her book, as I remember it, was DDT. She convinced most of the whole country and had major acclaim, and the New Yorker magazine excerpted her book, and everybody read it, and all the progressives said this is the new wave of liberalism and of progressivism. It got so popular that by 1972, when the EPA was founded under the Nixon administration, the EPA banned DDT. Now, why did the EPA ban DDT? It's a very interesting question because an EPA committee had reviewed the science and the medicine behind the claims of human damage, and the scientists at the EPA said it wasn't dangerous and we shouldn't regulate it. But the head of the EPA, a guy named Ruckelshaus, had read the book, and so he knew it was dangerous, so he personally made sure that it was banned. And it was not only not produced in the United States anymore, we were the biggest manufacturer, but it has been successfully eliminated from most countries of the world. The net result is that about 1 million African children who live in areas that are endemic with malaria are dying every year, and it's 40 years, so the book is very successful. And the idea is very successful. It has killed about 40 million African children. That's with the help of the EPA. Okay. Anyway, this is the first example that I'm going to talk about where there are scientists who do good science and report it to the bosses of their enterprise, and the science is overruled by a political boss or a political master or a director of a government agency. The EPA has continued with this kind of thing for all of its history. It's getting worse now. Okay, the EPA now is not a responsive organization or a reactive organization looking for harms and proven difficulties. It is now an activist organization looking for things that haven't happened yet, but could be by extrapolation happen, especially if you believe in the linear no threshold hypothesis of everything, and that everything is harmful in small doses, and you might consider banning almost anything depending on the dose. The last five or 6 years have been especially harmful with respect to the DDP. Obama appointed a woman by the name of Lisa Jackson as the head of the EPA. She just recently resigned. We'll talk about that in a moment. And the new substitute for her is a woman named Gina McCarthy. We'll talk about her briefly later on. Okay. If you open your blue jackets, on the last page, on the left-hand side, is a piece of paper entitled the EPA's Bill of Wrongs. No relation at all to the Bill of Rights. In fact, probably the opposite of the Bill of Rights. Okay. In the news recently, increasingly, is the war on coal. This is not just a slogan made up by the media. This is actually a statement by one of Obama's chief advisors, a guy named Schrag, a year or two ago, and what he said is, we need a war on coal. And Obama is not quoted as saying he accepts that explicitly, but all of his actions recently would imply that he does accept it implicitly, that he is making a war on coal. Now this is very curious because coal makes about 40% of our electricity, and it's the cheapest electricity that we make as far as I know, and the amount of actual pollution of the conventional variety that they make is decreasing every year. So why is there a war on coal? It's because of the fear of CO2 in the atmosphere. And coal, one molecule of the carbon in coal, when it's burned with oxygen, makes one molecule of CO2. There's much less hydrogen in coal than the other types of fuel, of so-called fossil fuel, and therefore it makes more CO2 per unit of energy than natural gas, for example. The war on coal now is basically sour grapes. The Obama administration tried to get two pieces of legislation enacted in previous Congresses. One was a tax on carbon, and one was a cap and trade type of legislation. As you know, they were defeated in Congress, and so Obama is not using Congress. He's going around Congress, as he has already promised and threatened and started to do by going through his agencies and through executive orders to get things done which Congress, representing the American people, would not normally allow. Okay. Item 2 in the Bill of Wrongs. The mandate to regulate CO2 is about 3 or 4 years old. Well, I forgot the exact date. 2007, does that sound right? And it comes from a claim of endangerment. As a matter of fact, 2 of the previous speakers mentioned that, and one speaker put up a slide that actually was the cover of the endangerment finding of the EPA, which allowed it to classify carbon dioxide and carbon as a pollutant. The Clean Air Act was passed by Congress, and it allows classification as a pollutant of any substance which is in the air and harmful to the health of human beings. The EPA data on this was taken from health records. They looked at the death certificates of all the people that died throughout the year with the diagnosis of heat or heat stroke or heat prostration. They counted up those death certificates. They increase in the summer months. They increase during heat waves. And if CO2 leads to heating or warming in the United States, then it is a pollutant because when the temperature goes up, there's more deaths during the summer. That is the entire substance of their endangerment finding and claim, and it has been accepted in courtrooms of the United States, including, unfortunately, the Supreme Court, and that is the legal basis for their ability to regulate carbon or carbon dioxide. Now you might be saying, what about other things that happen as a function of temperature? We'll leave that for a moment aside. Okay. Well, anyway, if you're reading item 2 there, what did they discount? They discounted the deaths in the winter because the deaths in the winter don't say cold prostration or freezing to death. They say myocardial infarction, cardiac failure, pneumonia, cerebrovascular accident, that's the same thing as stroke. Whatever every responsible epidemiologist on the earth knows, and what is all over the literature of public health and epidemiology, is that there's an enormous number of deaths in the winter due to those 3 diseases, heart disease, pulmonary disease, and strokes. and the death certificates say myocardial infarction or CVA or something like that. The EPA scientists did not count those because it didn't say heat. They just counted the death certificates that said cold, or they discounted the ones that might be related to cold, and they counted only the ones that were related to heat. Anyway, that's how they got the mandate through. Let's see what the second slide shows. Okay, well, this is just an elaboration of the DDT story. This is a long article, and it's a cover story on a magazine called, I guess it's Politics, and it says the DDT ban breeds death, and that's an enlarged picture of a mosquito. Like it says, investigation by the US EPA, if you can read down there, found that it was safe 40 years ago. It's still banned. Okay. Now, the essence of the regulation of carbon dioxide, in this case the war on coal, is these two ideas that there is warming caused by human activity, especially the burning of fossil fuels, and that warming is harmful to our health. Let's look at those two assumptions now. First of all, you've seen this graph already today. It's an extremely important graph. It has bounced all over the world through the media, and it is extremely important because it's not from the Heartland Institute, it's not from any of us, it's from the British or the UK Met Office. Met stands for meteorological. That is basically the National Weather Bureau of Great Britain, and I'm not sure whether they have any conflicts of interest here, but this is their data on the temperature levels for the last 16 years. This is 1999, I can't read this from here. 1994 through 2012, thank you. I'm sorry it's blurry, I don't have my usual source of scanning, but you can read the basic ideas here. The average temperature 15 years ago on this measure was 0.5 degrees centigrade anomaly, and as of this last data here, it's exactly the same. So if you draw a simple straight line through all of this data and to average out all the fluctuations, what does it mean? It means the temperature, the average global surface temperature of the world has not warmed in this entire long period. Has carbon dioxide stayed stable? Have we cut all our emissions all over the world so that no more carbon dioxide is emitted? Absolutely not. Carbon dioxide has been going up at more or less of its usual rate, not from us, but from China, India, and the rest of the world. So the first assumption in the endangerment that it's getting warmer because of human activity is false. Okay? Global warming, according to this data, stopped 16 years ago. This has been confirmed by people who were believers in HEW, by the so-called the Hadley Center and a couple of other groups that have provided the data for the IPCC in the past now have agreed that this data is correct. Next slide. Not only is it correct, but they've gone one step further. And again, you've seen this graph before in a slightly different form, I think once or twice already this morning. This is a sort of like a popularized slide of the result of a spectacular miscalculation. The data is from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, believe it or not. What the data shows, the orange and red is the estimates from the theory of anthropogenic global warming of what the temperature should be based on the existing CO2 measurements. You can see it goes there, and then after 1960, this part is a fit, where they modified the equations and the assumptions and the parameters to fit the previous temperature up to about this point here. And then from here on, this is a projection of what should it be, what the temperature range should be, given the CO2 that we know. Red, I think, is the 75% degree of certainty, and they allowed an even wider variation. Their confidence level is more than 95% that the temperature levels will be within this orange envelope here. Well, as of that point, they were barely at the edge. Now, as you saw in a slide this morning, they're actually off the edge. So what we can say now is that we are 95% certain that all of the models are wrong, and most of them are way, way wrong. We cannot trust them. We certainly cannot use them for public policy or for banning anything or regulating CO2. Okay, any questions about this so far? These are vital points. Thank you. All right.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I have a question.
Yes.
Whose is that? I mean, leaving aside the question of whether the average world temperature even means anything, whose average, official average was that on the slide?
That was from the IPCC. But they take the data from the Climate Center in Britain. What do they call it? Thank you. The CRU, the Climate Research Unit in Anglia. I have a topology problem. How to get my jacket off without losing my amplifier? Do we have any mathematicians in the audience? Or a haberdasher with the scissors? Thank you. Okay. Anyway, one person stood up, at least one, a whole lot of them actually, but I was vocal here, and said, what the hell is happening here? Why didn't you count the data on deaths from cold? Because when it gets warmer, there's fewer deaths from cold. So this is 3 papers that I issued or published. Oh, I'm in the wrong. You can't press this button here to change the slide. Anyway, they gave these papers at the International Congress on Climate Change. One of them is published in the Journal of the AAPS, et cetera. It has never been argued with. Nobody has disproven any of the points, and it's now 3 or 4 years since this was published, and there's now 30 more papers in the epidemiologic literature that agree with my data and my conclusions, and there is no contradictory data. So these are facts. My attribution at the time was that the EPA has made an innocent blunder. Somebody in there didn't really know the data or the epidemiology or the public health implications, and they put this out of good faith or good intentions. After 3 years of this, I don't think it's an honest blunder anymore. I think it's a deliberate fraud. Okay? Let's see what's happening. Here's more evidence of the fraud. This is a recent publication, I think this year, this is 2011, from a journal called Environmental Science and Technology. The title is Climate Change-Related Temperature Impacts on Warm Season Heat Mortality, Proof of Concept Methodology, blah, 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 blah. Do you think there's a paper on cold? No. So they're still publishing data on deaths from warmth and totally ignoring the data on benefits from warming in the winter. The fraud continues. Okay. So that's one episode of what's called ethical and scientific corruption in the EPA. Here's another. We have to credit, I think this was Steve Malloy. No, who did this? Pardon? Chris Bullock? Oh, Chris Horner, exactly. Chris Horner, working with the CEI, again with the Competitive Enterprise Institute, sued because they wanted to get the secret emails. What secret emails? It turns out that Lisa Jackson wanted to avoid the Freedom of Information Act, which allows a private citizen to write the government and get copies of most government transactions as part of the so-called transparency idea. Anyway, it was found out that Lisa Jackson took a different name for her email called Richard Windsor, which by accident was the name of her dog. And the idea was that she could do her real business undercover with a false email address that was not discoverable under the Freedom of Information Act. Anyway, Horner and CEI succeeded, and they were able to get 12,000 emails from the so-called secondary email account of Lisa Jackson. And some people speculate that being caught with her hand in an illegal transaction was part of the reason for her resignation. I don't know. Okay. Anyway, there's other evidence of corruption in the EPA. This one was discovered by Steve Malloy. The EPA has a so-called independent advisory group of so-called independent scientists who give them advice about what to do next. Is there science being done properly, et cetera? Almost all major research organizations have that. But what Steve discovered is that the EPA gives them all grants, the least being several $1 million. What does that sound like? That sounds like conflict of interest to me, and that's entirely unethical in science. They're getting a reward for giving their advice in the form of a big grant. Of course, they get money from the grant, and that ensures their tenure at the university or research institute that they're at. So this is definitely conflict of interest. It's entirely unethical for a so-called scientific organization. Another one that was discovered by Steve Malloy along with J.D. Dunn was that they are doing experiments on so-called volunteers who aren't given full consent, full informed consent, to have them inhale particulates from diesel exhausts. There's a controversy about particulates that are smaller than 2.5 microns in size. They're called PM 2.5, and I want to thank Jane Orient for exposing some of this in Civil Defense Perspectives. I forgot the actual date. The point is that they are doing unethical experiments. They're doing experiments on people that if the theory that the EPA is using is correct, some of them could die from the particulates. This has also been exposed. I'm not sure if there's been any response. But just to give you an example of how phony it is, I think the maximum limit in the United States is 10 parts per million of particulates of size 2.5 microns and smaller. In Beijing, last summer, there was a day when there was 890 parts per million of PM 2.5. That's 89 times as high as the United States safe limit. And the EPA doctrine is that that is fatal. Guess how many deaths there were in Beijing from particulates causing respiratory death? No, there was an accident and a guy couldn't see because the particulates were so thick in the atmosphere. There were 0 deaths from pulmonary causes. So that whole standard is false. Nevertheless, the EPA wants to make it the national standard, and it's already been happening in California, which is my home state. And in California, it's threatening to disable the trucking industry because diesel engines have to be changed to go with the new standards, and farmers use diesels, and there's all kinds of businesses that use diesels that are going to be economically attacked by this type of regulation. Okay. Okay, now what about the current leadership of the EPA? Well, yeah, here we are. This is Gina McCarthy. This is a headline from Environmental and Climate News, which is one of my favorite publications. And Jay Lear was in the audience the other minute. You can be very proud of this, Jay. Jay has a column in here every month also, and some of the most useful information you can find in this whole field. Anyway, this is front page. Guess what the headline is? Obama chooses energy foe McCarthy to lead EPA. The article is by James Taylor, who's excellent in general. And Gina McCarthy also has wonderful credentials. She's been an environmental activist in the past. That's the point. Okay? In particular, she is an advocate of carbon dioxide restrictions, and energy restructuring, which means getting rid of coal. So that's just exactly what we need to run the EPA at this time. She's also a little bit of an outlier. Most government agencies use $6 million as the value of a human life, either lost or saved. But Gina, in order to inflate the calculated benefit of EPA programs, uses $9 million. And they say if you're 80 years old and we extend your life by 1 month, that's a life saved. That's $9 million on our bottom line for credit for the EPA. That's why you cannot believe the EPA statistics on the good that they do. Next slide. Oops. Okay, now you can't read this very well. It's from a magazine article. Maybe I can read it. How many people have not heard of fracking? Fantastic. Okay, I won't define it very much. Basically, it's hydraulic fracturing. You sink holes in the ground, sometimes laterally instead of vertically. You put in fluids at high pressure, mostly water, but also some chemicals that probably act as solvents to get the fossil fuels out. That would be natural gas and oil. This is a news article in one of the business journals. The EPA is tackling fracking. They don't like fracking now. They did 7 years ago. They were asked to do a study of the safety of fracking, and it passed. Their scientists said that fracking was safe and unlikely to cause any harm to human health whatsoever. Therefore, it should not be under the purview of the EPA. But guess what? The EPA ignored that, and they're starting to attack fracking again. This is another example of the politicians overruling the scientists. And even in the state, even at the state level, it's happening again. This year, the New York Department of Public Health did an investigation of the health effects of fracking, and they said none are expected. So guess what did Governor Cuomo do? He said we're going to have a 4-year moratorium until we do some more research. Okay, now, fracking is a major economic good. This is producing oil and natural gas at low prices within the United States. We don't have to bring it in from Qatar or any Arab country. It's essentially safe. And also, the natural gas that it produces makes less CO2 if you still believe that CO2 could be harmful. And the coal is at low cost and it's relatively clean. And no coal miners die in this process. So it has a lot of advantages, and it's part of the reason why our CO2 emissions are falling. Let me just give you the numbers. It's down 20%. It's the lowest in the past 20 years, and it's down 14% since 2007. So even for the people that believe anthropogenic global warming is a risk, it's a much better fuel than we've had in the past, but the EPA still wants to try to stop it. Next slide. You've all probably seen headlines like this. The EPA is going to try to get the average fuel mileage in the United States up to 54.5 miles per gallon by 2025. Here's a graph. Anyway, this is what the EPA standards are going to rise to, and it's a smooth curve for automobiles. In fact, it's approaching 60 a few years later, and this is for light trucks. Now, I expected our automobile manufacturers to cry out in protest and ask for congressional modification. They are not complaining. Why do you think that is? Making all of the car, first of all, it hurts the competition from Europe and hurts any other competition besides the American manufacturers because they won't be able to bring in their cars unless they also follow the standard. Second of all, and more important, it makes the price of a car increase. What happens when the cost of the car increases? What happens when the cost of the car increases? The price of the car increases. What happens when the price of the car increases? The profit margin goes up, obviously. So all the American car makers have all of their colleagues to compete with, but they all have the same problem, and they're all going to benefit by increasing the price of the car and therefore increasing their profit margin. So that's why they're not complaining. You know who ought to complain and hasn't got a voice? The consumer. Obviously, consumers would like to see our cars not increase in price, but even Consumer Reports, which is on the environmental bandwagon, isn't complaining. The other fact, which is not widely known, is that the lighter the automobile, the more likely you are to die in a collision with a truck, a fixed object, but not with another light car, because then the mechanics are about the same. But the point is that 2 of the 3 causes of death, collisions with trucks, which are about 1/3 of all collisions, especially 1/3 of all fatalities, and collisions with stationary objects, those deaths will increase. And I don't know who's supposed to protest about that, but that's the way it is. Okay. Now, cars aren't alone. What about trucks? Whoops. Well, I don't have a slide for particulates. We'll just talk about that. And again, I'm going to refer you back to Jane Orient, who has a great story about particulates. In fact, Cork Hayden has several articles about this in his newsletter. This is an amazing group here. We have not just authors of books, but authors of monthly bulletins, also Jay Lair, for example, that give you the best and most comprehensive coverage of news that you do not see in the major media. So anyway, thank you to all of you people who have contributed to our wisdom. Anyway, the point is that the particulates are in diesel exhausts, and trucks have diesel engines, and so they're trying to make the truck industry and the farmers, et cetera, who use diesel to change their engines. Then there's another area that I'm intimately familiar with, and that is radon. I've actually given a talk on this. The best talks on radon were from another fellow member and contributor to this organization, a guy named Bernard Cohen. Many of you were here last year and you heard that he had passed away last year, but for those of you who didn't, he's probably the #1 guy in the country on the health effects of radon, and he proved conclusively that there is no harm from natural radon in your house with respect to the induction of lung cancer. What he also showed was that radiation hormesis does apply, that people who have higher radon levels in their houses and live in higher radon areas, such as the mountains, Colorado, Alaska, et cetera, have less lung cancer if you control for smoking. So Bernard Cohen is a hero, and he's been forgotten by the media, unfortunately. In fact, guess what? The EPA now has a campaign in the media to scare people about radon. Here's a headline in the newspaper, a full-page banner headline in Fairbanks, Alaska, this January. The risks of radon. Now, what do they show you in front of a CT or an MRI machine? I have no idea. I guess that's the only machine they have a picture of. And then the subtitle is that a speaker sponsored by the EPA is going to give a lecture in Fairbanks in January about the risks of radon and how you can get the radon out of your house for less than $45,000. Anyway, there was one guy who read this paper and got really angry. Guess who? Me. So I wrote a letter to the newspaper, which was published exactly a week later, and they gave me just as much space, but they didn't give me a picture of an MRI machine. They gave me a picture of Alaska, and what I did is explain that the radon at these levels is not harmful, et cetera, et cetera. So the enraged citizen, especially the informed enraged citizen, can have an impact, and sometimes you can get basically tit for tat on false stuff that you read in the newspaper. Okay. Roman numeral number 9 is about costs. The costs of the EPA to the economy. Let's see. I don't think I have a slide for that. Let's see what I've got there. No. This is the other one. I'm just going to let this one sit. Well, you can dwell on that too. Okay. The EPA frequently tries to justify its regulations by making exaggerated claims of their benefits in terms of lives extended or lives saved, or in terms of economic savings. They never advertise the direct or indirect costs of their programs. And they usually exaggerate those benefits by doing things like giving themselves $9 million worth of credit for extending the life of an 80-year-old by 1 month. Okay. Furthermore, they don't advertise what their budget is, so I don't have that number for you. Does anybody know what the budget of the EPA is? Okay. Anyway. So, several independent sources have tried to estimate the cost of their programs to the general public. One of them is the Competitive Enterprise Institute, also abbreviated CEI. They came up with a number for last year, so this is current stuff, of $353 billion. I don't know whether it sounds large or small to you, but it's actually a reasonable estimate because it has been checked accidentally by another independent organization called the Management Information Service that looked at the cost of EPA programs in the 6 industrialized Midwestern states: Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, etc. And by different methods, they calculated for those 6 states a loss of 3.5 million jobs. Remember, 6 times 3.5 is about 20 million jobs, and $42 to $82 billion loss of GDP. Now, if you take 6 states and their population, that's about 1/6 of the American population. So you multiply those damage by 6, and you get a central value of about $360 billion. So by independent calculations, 2 non-governmental organizations calculate $350 billion roughly as the approximate cost of EPA programs to our economy. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean in human costs? And I'm thankful to Jane for this calculation. Epidemiologists look at things, and public health authorities and interested people like us look at data on the correlation between gross domestic product per person or gross national product per person versus lifespan. It turns out there's a very strong correlation. Richer countries' citizens are healthier and live longer than the citizens of poorer countries. The correlation is so strong that the correlation coefficient is 0.954. And remember, at 1 point, this is almost 1, and 1 means a perfect correspondence between health and wealth. Okay, so what that means is if you take a hit on your GDP of $353 billion, that's about 2% of the total economy, and the average lifespan in the United States is about 75 years. 2% of 75 years is 1.5 years. So that means the EPA is costing each of us, on the average, about 18 months of our lifespan. That's the human cost that they don't advertise. There's another way of looking at the human effect of this kind of waste, and that is the cost of life saved, and if you waste more money, how many more lives do you lose? So if you use $6 million, which is the standard government value now, it was $1 million 50 years ago. But the dollar has gone down by at least a factor of 6 since then. So the point is, if you divide 6 million to 350 billion, it comes out with 60,000 lives lost per year due to EPA programs. 60,000 lives. Guess how many people die of breast cancer every year now? It's about 30,000. Guess how many people die of prostate cancer every year? About 30,000. So if this type of logic is appropriate, the harm to our economy from the EPA is equal to the loss of 60,000 lives. That's the total deaths from breast cancer and prostate cancer. And my question is, can we say that the EPA is a cancer on our society? Then, now we're ready for factor 10. The buzzword in all of our colleges and universities now, in fact, you've already heard it this morning, sustainability. How many people are familiar with this and use it in their daily conversation? How many people know the definition of sustainability? Well, Dr. Hayden, of course. Sorry I asked. No, I'm not. This shows the general ignorance of it. It is trying to overtake our whole society. The EPA has adopted sustainability as its next crusade. This is a journal article in a quasi-scientific journal, or maybe scientific, called Environmental Science and Technology. The date is, I think it's this year. I can't read the date. The author is an interesting name, Paul Anastas. Fundamental changes to EPA's research enterprise, the path forward. This is an article about their primary goal of the next 10 years. There it is, sustainability. Okay, what does that mean? Maybe it's nice. What's that? Exactly. Well, the UN has adopted it. It's part of their agenda, and it is their agenda, in fact, using this is called Agenda 21. The UN would like to have a larger EPA of their own. I guess they already think they are. Okay. As I say, there is no standard definition of the word. I'm going to use the definition that Dr. Anastas uses in his paper. It just so happens to be the same definition that our previous speaker mentioned by a Norwegian named Brundtland. Okay, this Brundtland, actual name is Gro Brundtland. He was formerly the Prime Minister of Norway, and he says that it means that we may develop and meet the needs of current generations only to the extent that doing so, and I quote, will not compromise the ability of future generations to meet their needs. Now that sounds a little bit familiar to me. It sounds sort of like, well, let's see, the slogan that I heard in high school, and I thought it was wonderful. From each in the current generation, according to his abilities, and to each in future generations, according to their needs. Does that sound familiar? Well, who said that? Karl Marx. Isn't that a surprise? Okay. It sounds so nice that it has been adopted not just by the United Nations, but by the EPA. Okay. It's quoted specifically on page 2 of this actual paper. Now, who is Paul Anastas? Well, he's the Director of Research and Development for the EPA. His title is Assistant Administrator for Research and Development. He is most famous as, quote, the father of green chemistry. Now, I took advanced honors chemistry in university, and I didn't know that chemistry had colors or politics. I just took chemistry. When I hear chemistry entitled as green chemistry, I start to think of the Germans in the 1930s who had Aryan physics. The reason why they had Aryan physics, because they want to get rid of the Jewish physicists who believed in something as stupid as relativity or quantum mechanics. Okay. Anyway, it makes me nervous. But he goes on. He defines the pillars of sustainability as follows. There's 3. Economy, environment, and society. Okay? That's another wow. By that criterion, with economy first, the whole United States government is entirely unsustainable. Sustainability means you don't consume in your generation what the future generation will need. It means you don't have a national debt, an explicit national debt of $17 trillion or unfunded obligations of $100 to $200 trillion that has to be extracted from our children and our grandchildren. Well, anyway, so I guess that means we got to get rid of the government. It's not sustainable. Well, I'm not that grandiose. All I want to do is get rid of the EPA. Okay, so what to do? Next slide. Okay, this is one of our colleagues. This is Henry Miller, whose largest association in the past was with the American Council for Science and Health, mentioned by one of our previous speakers, which I'm a longtime member and contributor to. Now I think he's at the Hoover Institution. Is that right, Jay? Okay. He's a brilliant guy. He was previously in the FDA. When he was in the FDA, he sort of looked around at the other similar government scientific organizations. And what he found is, we need a stepladder for old guys. Okay. Oh, I can't read that either. Luckily, I have the master copy. Sorry about that. You have it at, let's see if you can read the copy that's at the next page of your handout. Let's turn it over. These are outrageous accusations coming from a mild-mannered scientist. Okay. One of the harshest lessons concerned the perfidy and incompetence of one of FDA's siblings, the Environmental Protection Agency. They believe in the precautionary principle, which is adopted by Europe. It's basically either a Luddite or a fascist way of running things, whereby basically everything which isn't required is forbidden unless you can prove that it's entirely harmless forever. Then he says, I was baffled by all this till I realized that EPA was a miasma populated by the most radical, disaffected, and anti-industry discards from other agencies, and that's because it's protect us from bad things. There was entrenched institutional paranoia and an oppositional worldview. And Miller thinks that the reason why we are shrinking in terms of our economic freedom is partly because of the EPA. We have shrunk from down to 10th place in economic freedom after Chile and the estimable Mauritius. Well, anyway, that's what Miller thinks about the EPA. And the question is, what can we do about it? One thing is get our Congress people to raise their consciousness about the harm of the EPA and get them to try to pass legislation which might decrease the power of the EPA in specific areas. One suggestion is get the Congress to try to push the definition of a pollutant such that carbon dioxide would no longer be listed as a pollutant. There could be further legal pressure, and SEPP, pioneered by Dr. Fred Singer, who's in the audience, I believe, has a lawsuit against the EPA because of the faulty definition, the faulty enforcement of the endangerment principle. So those are things that we can do. My idea is stealing from an idea that was our bane and has been our bane in trying to build anything new for the past 50 years, and that's, it is called the Environmental Impact Report, EIR. Every major enterprise has to file a research report showing that their project will not damage anything, any frog, any plant in the environment. And those are very costly, and they often result in delays of 2 to 3 or 4 years because there can be opposition from the environmental wackos who don't want your environmental impact report to be accepted. Given the current situations, recession and unemployment in the United States, I think it's much more important to have an economic impact report. Maybe we should call the EEIC to distinguish from the other IR and from the EIR. But the mechanism would be not to ask the EPA to generate, they have to generate their report on the economic impact of what they're going to do, but they can't be involved in accepting it. It has to be an independent agency, hopefully either scientific or economic expertise. I'm thinking of the National Academy of Engineering because the National Academy of Sciences is already corrupted for AGW. And if that report has to prove that the actual economic benefits are greater than the harms. So that's another humble idea. I think that's all I have except for one last thing. This was published the day I left home in American Spectator, July the 5th, that not only is the EPA growing in its own centralized self, but it is now encroaching on the power of the states. Every state has an environmental protection kind of agency, and the EPA now is trying to overrule the states and overcome their regard for their own citizens and basically nationalize and federalize the entire process and take away from the federalist idea of the power of the individual states to judge their individual business better than the federal government could. Thank you very much.
I agree 100% with everything you've said, but as unbelievable as it sounds, the problem with the EPA is much, much, much worse than you have represented. In that the EPA has subverted the US Constitution in numerous respects. Number one, they have set up their own internal administrative courts. If you are accused by the EPA, you do not get to go to trial in a real court with a real judge and a real jury. You go before an EPA court whose judge is an employee of the EPA and is subject to promotion or discipline by the EPA administrator, and whose verdict, if in a 1 in a million shot it contradicts the EPA's case, goes in your favor, can actually be set aside by the administrator. Okay, number two, okay, the first US Congress passed a federal criminal code. It contained 20 crimes which any reasonable person would have known in advance was probably a crime, okay? The EPA has created over 5,000 crimes, okay, which no one even knows what they are. Okay, not even at the EPA. And furthermore, additions and stipulations to these crimes are spelled out in inter-office memos that aren't even published in the Federal Register. And yet people are expected to know what these laws are and be subject to prosecution if they violate them. This violates mens rea, which is a principle of Anglo-Saxon law that predates the Constitution. Okay, beyond that, they will also prosecute people for actions that were legal at the time they were done, but have subsequently been made illegal.
That's ex post facto, that's unconstitutional.
Exactly, but they do it as well. So that, and in addition, even people who are trying very, very hard to comply with EPA registrations, and so if they have, half a kilogram of some toxic substance, they don't just throw it in the dumpster and get rid of it. They hire an official certified firm to dispose of it for them in all the certified ways, okay, therefore unwisely creating a paper trail for themselves, because then when the EPA later says that that was illegal to do, okay, they get prosecuted and they can be fined for billions of dollars if it's put in a place which the EPA subsequently calls a Superfund site. They can be held responsible for cleaning up the entire site. Okay, the list goes on and on. I would recommend to people here 2 books that they should really read on this subject, because people here may be in general aware of these mega crimes of the EPA that Howard has outlined, but not of many of these additional things, which are very, very serious. There's a book by a man named James DeLong called Out of Bounds, Out of Control. You can get it from Amazon, and Regulation at the EPA. And another book by a man named James Bovard called Lost Rights, which deals with this problem both at the EPA and other federal agencies which are currently carrying on in similar fashion. But this is very, very serious stuff. And in the reform of the EPA, there's additional things that are needed. Number one, you got to get rid of the system of administrative courts. If the EPA has an accusation to make against someone, it's got to be done in a real court. Okay, there can't be ex post facto prosecutions. Okay, mens rea has got to be obeyed. They have to rewrite their regulations into a form that is brief and comprehensible. And in fact, I believe a correct defense is if they should ask the jury if any of them knew about any of these laws, okay, before this trial. If they did not, then they should find the defendant not guilty on that basis. That if the EPA has a complaint against someone that they're violating some obscure regulation, they should simply send them notice, stop doing that, and if they comply, fine. But they can't crucify them for doing that. And so forth. But anyway, the legal aspect of this is really important, and I'd recommend those 2 books, Lost Rights and Out of Bounds, Out of Control. Thanks.
I have an answer to that which goes even further, but we'll take the questions from the audience first.
It's not a question, it's a comment. Dr. Maccabee, you gave a very good bill of particulars against the EPA. One comment, since we are in Houston, the center of the U.S. oil industry, I'm a geologist who spent some years in the oil industry. Item number 5 that you had on the fracking. One item on fracking that is sometimes being reported in the media is that actually fracking is about 60 years old. It has been done since the late 1940s. It's not something new, although the scope and the magnitude has increased lately as a result of the tight shale gas and oil. The other point on fracking that is never mentioned in the media and that is very important for everybody to know who addresses anything on fracking is that no oil company has any interest at all fracking what is called out of zone, that is going outside of the zone where the petroleum is into groundwater zones. If their fracking job goes out of zone into the groundwater and contaminates the groundwater, regardless of whether some environmentalist or the EPA finds out that they did contaminate the groundwater, that company is losing money. An oil company has no interest whatsoever in contaminating anything. They're losing money if they do so.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Harrison Brundage. I'm experienced with fracturing as a petroleum geologist when I was in Ohio and West Virginia. One thing I wanted to emphasize is that overuse of the term chemicals, which they always use in the news media, distorts the whole thing in that the chemicals mainly are such things as guar gum. And this is a good thing because, among other things, this was all imported from Pakistan and India. Now we have a domestic guar gum industry. It's in West Texas. It's around Lubbock, where Texas Tech is. And those of you going back to California, I want you to notice if you fly over these circular patterns of contour plowing, whereby every farmer and rancher wants to keep his own money, his own water, and not have it flow off to his neighbor. You'll notice that there are little rectangular pieces in each corner that don't appear to be productive. Now they're growing guar gum there, and it's a legume, and it's a new industry. It was a very interesting article in the Journal of Petroleum Technology recently that I'd recommend to people, and it's really a win-win situation all around.
Thank you very much.
I have a very simple-minded question, since I am very simple-minded.
That's why you're such a great scientist.
Howard has mentioned SEPP, our organization, is one of the many co-plaintiffs against the EPA in their action against their endangerment finding. The endangerment finding is, to explain this, is something that says that CO2 is harmful to human health and welfare, and therefore falls within the purview of the Clean Air Act. And this is the whole basis of EPA's attempt to control emissions from coal plants and from automobiles and so on. My question is the following. The Clean Air Act is an act of Congress. It has been amended, I think, a couple of times. It can always be amended again. Is there any reason why Congress cannot simply pass an amendment stating very clearly that carbon dioxide is not a criteria pollutant under the Clean Air Act? I'm addressing myself to all the lawyers here in the audience. I know that every MD I've ever met is also a part-time lawyer, so I'm sure that you will have an answer for me. I'm sure it'll pass in the House. I think something like this might even pass in the Senate. It'll certainly be vetoed in the White House, but there's a good chance that a veto could be overridden. And this is a chance people in the White House may not wish to take. So it's a realistic type of thing to ask, and I hope that somebody here will have some answers on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you. So our complaints are not in vain,
No.
we hope. Go ahead.
Thank you for your talk. Like Dr. Zubrin, I agree only more so. But I don't think either
You
of
want
you
to come
go,
up here?
I don't think either of you go far enough. You suggest in your bill of particulars against the EPA it's not politically possible to abolish them.
I said it may not be possible. Go ahead.
Well, I don't think anything is achieved by aiming small. The only legitimate purpose of government is to protect individual rights. The EPA can't possibly do that. There's no possible purpose. There's nothing to be gained from this organization. We have to try and get rid of them. Let them take the defensive and say, well, perhaps maybe if we acted more, a little bit less like a star chamber, you might let us stay around in some smaller form. But let's try and get rid of them. That should be our aim.
Jay Lair, the Romney administration asked me to write a paper for them during the campaign, asking my position, Heartland's position, on what we do with EPA. And I wrote, I thought, a very simple, basic paper explaining, obviously, that we would do away with EPA, but I explained in detail how. And we would create a committee of the whole of the 50 state EPAs, each of whom is strong enough and bad enough in their own. And they would collectively form committees replacing the 14 different offices in Washington that make up EPA. And I even went so far as to create a 5-year outline of phasing them out one after the other. And the only group that I would keep would be the research units that aren't too bad. I don't think the paper ever saw the light of day. I have it if anyone would like to see it. I'd be happy to send them a copy of it. It's not very long and pretty easy to read. I've asked now that things have gotten out of hand and we published the article you showed in ECN recently. I've asked my boss, Joe Bass, if he would consider running the essay I wrote, maybe serializing it, to get people into the idea that we can clearly do without US EPA and be way ahead in every way. We need some kind of body. I think a committee of the whole of 50 agencies would be relatively easy. I calculated that we'd save 80% of the budget. I think I even figured out what the budget was. And we would headquarter them in Topeka, Kansas, because that's the center of the United States. I mean, it was a very basic idea. I'm sad that I never heard anything out of Romney. But if anyone would like that paper, if there's any interest, maybe I can convince Joe to republish it. Finally, a comment on fracking, as was made. We've been fracking for 60 years. I was involved in fracking oil wells that long ago in Texas. The sad thing about fracking is that the oil companies kept their formulations of the chemicals that they use, which are primarily, of course, water and sand. But the primary chemical used in fracking is a long-chain fatty alcohol that is probably on the lips of every woman in this room. That's why you can spread it out in a monomolecular layer. The oil industry really screwed up by thinking they had a better chemical, which certainly wasn't true. But we don't know of a single contamination problem there's ever been groundwater pollution in regard of fracking. Thank you.
So fracking is lip smacking good?
That's right. Hey, that's good. In fact, I give a lot of lectures on it, and I've advertised that I will drink anybody's fracking fluid, and that remains the case.
But the main point is that it can't possibly be poisonous.
Correct, correct.
Just a brief comment. I have a somewhat less ambitious plan than getting rid of the EPA. I wrote an article for Forbes not so terribly long ago. We should defund our participation in the IPCC. And because the Clean Air Act assault on carbon dioxide came out of the IPCC.
That's correct.
And is based upon that.
They used the IPCC data and arguments, exactly.
And since Congress and the House particularly controls the purse strings, that might be more achievable.
If there's no more questions, what do we do now? Oh yeah, I'll give my arguments. Okay. there's a very important idea which has absorbed much of Europe's intellectuals. It's called, or many of Europe's intellectuals, it's called the precautionary principle. Everybody's heard of that, right? Basically what it says, it's taking precautions against harming the environment, or anything for that matter. And it says you can't do anything that might harm the environment until you can prove that it won't harm the environment. Now that sounds sort of reasonable, but if you think about the meaning, it violates our basic human rights as understood in the English-speaking world. The basic rule of English or Anglo-Saxon common law, which is the basis of our common law, is that you are innocent until proven guilty. The essence of the precautionary principle is that you are guilty of harming the environment until you can prove yourself innocent. This is the basis of precautionary imprisonment, precautionary killing, precautionary measures of any type without limit. And basically every American who believes in the American or British common law and the fundamental rights of the individual should curse every time they hear the term precautionary principle. The EPA likes the precautionary principle. That is the source of the perfidy. Thank you.